So it's true.
I find that contradictory, sitting in front of a very successful man.
Ferris Bueller's Day Off may look like a carefree teen comedy to those who have seen it, but behind the laughs are surprising stories of a script written in under a week, older actors playing high schoolers, a Ferrari that wasn't real, a parade shot among real Chicago crowds, and even Paul McCartney's complaint about the soundtrack. In this video, we'll uncover 20 weird facts that show how John Hughes's bold choices turned one ordinary day off into a cultural classic. Sit back and enjoy. Speed written. Screenplay.
I want to talk about how you move from teen characters in movies to the preteen characters and the little kids and become one of the most...
One of the strangest things about Ferris Bueller's Day Off is how quickly the film became a reality. John Hughes didn't spend years working on it as most filmmakers do. He sat down in his Chicago home in early 1985 and, according to both the studio and Hughes himself, the script was ready, and he gave out the script in less than a week. Matthew Broderick has confirmed this in later interviews after the movie's release, saying he was stunned at how fresh the dialogue felt, as if it hadn't gone through endless rewrites. Hughes had a reputation for writing fast, and he didn't disappoint on this one. According to actress Mia Sara, who played Sloane, she remembered being amazed that her first table read was almost word for word and was nearly what ended up on screen. Alan Ruck, who played Cameron, also mentioned in interviews that Hughes would come to the set with new pages that he had typed up the night before, and it wasn't sloppy because it was his style. He trusted his instincts and wanted the characters to feel alive. That pace shows in the movie because the story unfolds with the same breathless speed with which Ferris lives his day, moving from one wild idea to the next. In an archived interview, Hughes said he was trying to capture the feeling of a day where anything seems possible. By writing so quickly, he caught that emotion before it faded. Broderick was Hughes' pick.
They bought it. Incredible. One of the worst.
When John Hughes was dreaming up Ferris Bueller, he noted that he already had one actor in mind. From the beginning, Hughes said he had pictured Matthew Broderick carrying the story because he wanted someone who could charm the audience, break the fourth wall, and still feel like a believable high school kid. In an interview, Hughes said Broderick had a natural likability that couldn't be taught. At the time of the movie's release, Matthew wasn't yet the big household name we know today. He had Broadway experience and had impressed critics in Brighton Beach Memoirs, but he wasn't the typical Hollywood leading man. Producer Tom Jacobson recalled that once Broderick's name came up for the role, nobody else felt right for the role. They needed someone who could talk directly to the camera without seeming fake, and Broderick nailed that test from the start. Interestingly, the studio still looked at other options by considering names like John Cusack, Jim Carrey, and even Tom Cruise floated around in casting conversations. But Hughes fought for his choice, and in later interviews, Alan Ruck remembered Hughes saying, "Ferris is Matthew, Matthew is Ferris." That confidence paid off. Even Matthew admitted that he wasn't sure he could pull off the non-stop confidence that Ferris had. He told Rolling Stone years later that he worried about being too smug while playing the role, but Hughes reassured him, saying the honesty in his eyes would balance the character's wild charm. Everyone's older than they look.
Got Matthew Broderick in Ferris Bueller's Day Off.
School, so that they'll be ahead in preschool, which I read about recently,
One of the funniest truths about Ferris Bueller's Day Off is that most of the high school students were nowhere near high school age. You would be surprised to know that Matthew Broderick was in his early 20s during filming. Alan Ruck, who played the role of Cameron Fry, was 29 years old, almost a full decade older than his character. In fact, Ruck joked in later interviews that he was worried audiences would notice that he was older than his role, saying, "I looked about 29, and I was 29. But Hughes brushed those fears aside. To Hughes, it was more important that the actors captured the feeling of being a teenager than their actual age. Mia Sara was the youngest of the trio, at only 18 years old. In a Vanity Fair interview, she later recalled that being surrounded by older co-stars made her feel like the little sister, which ironically fits Sloane's role as the emotional balance between Ferris's charm and Cameron's gloom. Jennifer Grey, who played Jeannie, was also in her mid-20s, and the age gap didn't matter on screen. Plus, her sibling rivalry with Broderick felt spot on. Both then and now, Hollywood has a long tradition of casting older actors as teens. Still, Hughes picked carefully because he wanted people who could deliver the depth of his dialogue, handle the fast shooting schedule, and still look young enough with makeup and styling. Producer Tom Jacobson admitted the studio was nervous about casting Rook, but Hughes insisted his chemistry with Broderick was worth more than a perfect age match. And Hughes was right because while watching the movie, audiences bought every second of their teenage rebellion. The energy they put into making their roles a reality was what mattered, not the birth certificate. The anyone, the teacher was a political speechwriter. Imagine you're in a classroom and your teacher is talking and talking and talking. Ben Stein's deadpan classroom scene where he yells, "Bueller?" Bueller has become a shorthand for boredom, but the story behind Stein's casting is just as unusual as his delivery in the film. Stein wasn't a comedian or a seasoned actor at the time. He came from a completely different world, and that world was the world of politics. Before Hughes gave him the role, Ben Stein had worked as a speechwriter for President Richard Nixon and President Gerald Ford. He also taught law and economics, making him perfect for the dry, monotone teacher role. In interviews, Hughes admitted that he initially wanted Stein for a tiny background part. Still, when production needed someone to play the role of the economics teacher, Stein was pushed forward as a last-minute idea. Stein slipped into his real-life professor mode when asked to improvise a short lecture. The result of the short lecture was a painfully dull but hilariously accurate classroom speech about supply-side economics. That wasn't scripted, it was Stein talking off the top of his head. Matthew Broderick later joked in a reunion interview that Stein's delivery was so convincing, he added that the cast actually felt like they were back in high school, zoning out during a lecture. The crew could barely keep a straight face while filming. Another thing that made Stein's cameo legendary is that it wasn't acting in the traditional sense. Hughes captured Stein simply being himself, which worked better than expected. The monotone voice, the long pauses, the complete lack of energy, all of it became pop culture gold. Years later, Stein laughed about the role, saying, "I didn't know I was funny, but audiences did." Parade scene, one take and 12 cameras. The downtown Chicago parade sequence is the beating heart of Ferris Bueller's Day Off. Watching it, you would see how it looks like a perfectly choreographed party that just happened to unfold. But the reality was a massive technical challenge. Director John Hughes wanted it to feel spontaneous, like Ferris had hijacked the city for one afternoon. To capture that scale, Hughes and choreographer Kenny Ortega staged the entire twist and shout number during an actual parade where they blended real spectators with extras and carefully placed cameras. Kenny Ortega, who later became famous for directing High School Musical, recalled in an interview that Matthew Broderick was terrified. "Matthew wasn't a dancer," Ortega said, and here he was, standing on a float in front of thousands of people. Hughes had to assure Broderick that he wouldn't have to dance repeatedly, but when the cameras rolled, he had to perform. The team had only one reel shot to pull it off, and they set up 12 cameras across the city, including cranes, rooftops, and hidden street corners to ensure nothing was missed. Some crowd reactions weren't staged at all, as they were ordinary Chicagoans who had no idea a movie was filming, were swept up in the moment, and joined in. That's why the parade feels so authentic, because much of it was. Mia Sara later remembered watching from the sidelines, amazed at how the crowd kept growing. "It felt like the whole city was singing with him," she said. Hughes later admitted it was one of the most nerve-wracking days of his career, but also one of the most rewarding. With just one take and a dozen cameras, he captured a scene that has lived in pop culture for nearly 4 decades. Beatles licensing cost and Paul McCartney's grumble. It's hard to imagine Ferris Bueller's Day Off without Ferris climbing onto that parade float and belting out Twist and Shout, but pulling off that sequence didn't just take guts despite much of the parade not being staged, it took money. Director John Hughes was determined to use the Beatles' original recording despite the notoriously high licensing fees. At the time, the Beatles' catalog was among the most expensive in the world, and Universal had to cut a serious check to make it happen. Producer Tom Jacobson later admitted it was one of the costliest music decisions in the film, but Hughes insisted it was worth every penny. The gamble paid off because the movie's release gave Twist and Shout a second life, and it brought the 1963 track back onto the Billboard charts more than 2 decades after its debut. Radio stations reported a surge in requests, with teens who hadn't grown up in the Beatles era suddenly calling in to hear it. But not everyone was thrilled about it. For example, Paul McCartney himself, in a later interview, confessed he wasn't a fan of the way the film had overdubbed brass instruments onto the track. They filled it out with brass, McCartney said, and it ruined it. Despite his complaints, he admitted that the renewed popularity of the song didn't hurt. Fans didn't care about the overdubs because all they cared about was the energy of Ferris lip-syncing in the middle of downtown Chicago. Matthew Broderick later reflected that performing to such an iconic track was terrifying but surreal, adding, "It was like the whole world knew the song, and suddenly they were all singing with me." Danke shown to Twist and Shout. Why the double song?
Much fun to make for you.
Yeah, at times. I mean, it was a lot of the fun that we...
One of the most surprising details about the parade sequence is that it doesn't just showcase Twist and Shout. Before Ferris went into singing the Beatles' classic, he warmed up the crowd with Wayne Newton's smooth ballad, which was called Danke Schoen. It seems like a quirky choice for a cheeky high schooler to lip-sync to a lounge number, but Hughes had an apparent reason for it. In interviews, Hughes explained that he wanted the parade to belong to everyone in Chicago. Danke Schoen was meant to appeal to the older crowd who might have been watching, while Twist and Shout was the anthem for pulling in the younger generation. By blending the two, Hughes created a moment connecting parents, kids, and grandparents in one shared sing-along. Matthew Broderick later admitted that he had no idea what Danke Schoen was before filming. "It was an odd song for a teenager to perform," he said, "but once I started, I understood the joke." Alan Ruck recalled watching Broderick on the float and thinking, "If he can sell this, he can sell anything." Wayne Newton commented years later that he was stunned to see that his song was featured in the movie. He said the scene gave the track a second life because it introduced it to a generation that never would have heard it otherwise. The Ferrari wasn't a true Ferrari.
It might be a lighthearted movie, but it's about something pretty important.
Well, I suggest...
Cameron's father's prized red Ferrari 250 GT California Spider is one of the most iconic cars in movie history. It is also one of the most misunderstood because for decades fans believed Hughes and his crew had destroyed a real multi-million-dollar Ferrari when Cameron kicks it into reverse and sends it crashing through the glass garage. The truth is a little less shocking, but it is fascinating that the production never used a real Ferrari. The Ferraris seen on screen were replicas of the original built by Modena Design and Development, a small shop in California. Hughes and his team commissioned 3 cars for filming, 2 functional models that could be driven and 1 lightweight shell used for the crash. In an interview, car enthusiast Neil Glassmoyer, who helped build the replicas, confirmed that Hughes initially approached Ferrari directly, but was quickly shut down. The company had no interest in loaning out such a rare vehicle for a teen comedy. Alan Ruck, who played the role of Cameron, later joked in interviews that people still come up to him saying, "I can't believe you destroyed that car." He always laughs and sets the record straight. "We didn't smash a real Ferrari, we couldn't have afforded to." Interestingly, the replicas have become valuable over time because one of the stunt cars used in filming sold at auction for hundreds of thousands of dollars. Can you imagine a fake Ferrari made for a movie about rebellion and joyrides ended up becoming a collector's item in its own right? That is hard to believe, but it became a collector's item. That careful balance between illusion and reality is classic Hughes. He gave audiences the thrill of watching a Ferrari crash through glass without actually wrecking one of the rarest sports cars in the world at the time. The Wrigley Field Mystery Game. One of the most unforgettable moments in Ferris Bueller's Day Off is when Ferris, Cameron, and Sloane ditch school and head to Wrigley Field to watch the Chicago Cubs. The shot of them sitting in the stands eating hot dogs and cheering like carefree teens has become essential to Chicago film history. But here's the strange part. Fans of the film who follow sports have spent years trying to figure out which actual Cubs game was filmed that day. On the surface, it should be easy to figure out, right? Because the Cubs play 81 home games each season, you'd think someone could nail it down. But the details are unclear because the scoreboard in the background shows the Cubs playing the Atlanta Braves, and baseball historians originally pegged it as a June 19, '85 matchup. However, the scene also features a foul ball that Ferris nearly catches, and some sharp-eyed fans argued that the sequence didn't align with that game. To make it more interesting, we would love for you to know that the cast has given conflicting answers. Matthew Broderick once admitted he doesn't remember which game it was, only that Hughes wanted it to feel authentic, like something a real Chicago kid would do when skipping class. On the other hand, Alan Ruck swears it was against the Braves and recalls the freezing wind that day. Over time, the Wrigley scene has become an urban legend because baseball fans still debate it online, even re-watching archived game footage to match angles. There's no definitive answer to this day, which only adds to the movie's playful mystique. Hughes didn't care about the score or who won because he wanted the vibe, the joy of playing hooky in Chicago, soaking in the sun, and pretending the world belonged to you. Art Institute, Hughes's refuge, made cinematic. Among the film's whirlwind of skipping school, fast cars, and trickery, the quietest moment occurs in the Art Institute of Chicago. For many of the film's fans, this slow sequence with Ferris, Cameron, and Sloane silently wandering through paintings and sculptures feels almost out of place. But for John Hughes, it was the heart of the film. Hughes grew up in the suburbs of Chicago and often visited the Art Institute as a young man. In interviews, he admitted it was his safe space to slow down, reflect, and feel inspired. Including it in Ferris Bueller's Day Off wasn't just about showing off a Chicago landmark, it was about sharing a piece of himself with the audience. "I wanted to capture what it feels like to fall in love with art for the first time," Hughes once explained. One of the most discussed shots is Cameron staring intensely at Georges Seurat's piece, which is called A Sunday Afternoon, on the island of La Grande Jatte. The camera cuts closer and closer until the brushstrokes blur into abstraction. Alan Ruck later said that moment perfectly symbolized Cameron's unraveling. The more he looks, the less he sees. That's exactly how Cameron feels about his own life. Crew members have also said that filming inside the Institute was a dream, though it required delicate planning where lights had to be positioned carefully to protect the artwork. The team had only limited hours each day. Today, the Art Institute sequence is widely praised as one of the most tender moments in any teen comedy. It slows down the chaos and reminds us that cutting class isn't just about goofing off, and this is because sometimes it's about finding beauty, reflection, and meaning in unexpected places. Life moves pretty fast wasn't in the original script. This next part concerns the most quoted line in Ferris Bueller's Day Off, which came to be when Ferris looked straight into the camera and said, "Life moves pretty fast. You could miss it if you don't stop and look around occasionally." But here's the truth. That line wasn't in John Hughes's original draft. You heard right. And according to editor Paul Hirsch, Hughes came up with it late in the editing process when he realized the film needed a unifying theme. The story had many great moments, but Hughes wanted one sentence that summed up Ferris's philosophy. That was how he scribbled down the famous line and had Matthew Broderick record it separately. Broderick later said in interviews that it felt almost like a personal reminder from Hughes himself. John was telling us something about how he saw life. It wasn't just Ferris talking, it was John talking. The line outlived the movie because it feels universal, like advice passed down directly from creator to audience. Interestingly, early test screenings of the film didn't even have the line, and some viewers complained the film felt funny but a little hollow, adding it gave the movie its soul. And even after decades of its release, it's been quoted in graduation speeches, ads, and even political campaigns. The early cut was much longer. The Ferris Bueller we all know runs under 2 hours, but the first cut of the film that Hughes screened was nearly 3 hours long. Much of what was trimmed from the first cut was extended day-in-the-life sequences, as they like to call them, because of the extra classroom bits, more with Ferris's siblings, and even a more extended phone subplot between Rooney and Grace, his secretary. Alan Ruck recalled watching an early version and being shocked at how spread out it was. There were whole scenes with me wandering around downtown that nobody's ever seen. Jennifer Grey also confirmed that some of her Jeannie material was cut, including a sequence showing her frustration before she storms out of school. Hughes was notorious for overwriting and then trimming later. Who could blame him for doing things his way? He once said, "I'd rather give the editor too much than too little." And editor Paul Hirsch admitted it was painful cutting scenes he loved, but pacing demanded it. The movie is about freedom and energy, and it had to move as fast as Ferris. Some deleted footage has surfaced in DVD extras, but much is still locked away in Paramount's archives. The film's fans have begged for a director's cut, but insiders doubt it will ever happen. Hughes was protective of his final vision and likely wouldn't have wanted a bloated version released. Still, the existence of those extended scenes adds a mythic quality to the film, just like Ferris himself, who constantly tells us that there's always more going on than what we see. John Hughes's tiny cameos in Shermer, Illinois. If you blink, you'll miss it, but something you have to know, which you didn't know, is that John Hughes actually gave himself a little cameo in Ferris Bueller's Day Off. Toward the end of the film, when Ferris's mom is driving home, a man can be seen crossing the street holding a newspaper. That man is Hughes, sliding into his movie like Alfred Hitchcock used to do. It's small, but it shows how personally connected he was to the story. Hughes also left another personal stamp on the town of Shermer, Illinois. Although the movie was filmed in and around Chicago, Hughes set many of his films like The Breakfast Club, 16 Candles, Weird Science, and Ferris Bueller in this fictional suburb. Shermer was based on his real hometown of Northbrook, where Hughes grew up. In interviews, Hughes explained that he invented Shermer to create a shared universe because he wanted audiences to feel like all his characters could bump into each other at the mall, school, or on a Chicago street. "It's the world I knew best," he once said. Matthew Broderick later said that shooting around Chicago felt very different from the heavy comedies from studios of the time. John was giving us his city. It was like a love letter to the places he grew up. So while Ferris's Day Off takes him through art museums, parades, and baseball stadiums, it's still grounded in Hughes's imagined Shermer, a place that's become just as real to fans as the actual Chicago landmarks. The Save Ferris cultural ripple. This may have started as a throwaway gag in the movie about the water tower painted with Save Ferris, but it quickly turned into a pop culture wave. After the film, real high schools and even baseball stadiums used the phrase on banners, scoreboards, and pep rallies. In the movie, the joke is simple. Classmates believe Ferris is gravely ill, but he's joyriding across Chicago. But the film's audiences loved it because it showed how quickly rumors can spread, especially in a school with such a tight-knit setting. Alan Ruck remembered being stunned when he saw the phrase appear in real life. "We were just making a movie, and then suddenly you'd go to a Cubs game and see Save Ferris on the board. That was surreal." The phrase took on a life of its own. Bands have used it as names, newspapers referenced it in headlines, and even charity campaigns borrowed it to grab attention. In the early 2000s, Saved Ferris became the name of a ska band, proving the joke had a life far beyond the film. Interestingly, Hughes never intended it to be a marketing hook because the crew members said it was painted on a water tower to add realism, like the town rallying behind a sick kid. Deleted scenes would have changed the meaning. Charlie Sheen's backstory. One of the most surprising things about Ferris Bueller's Day Off is how much was filmed and cut. Among the deleted scenes, the most talked about are the ones tied to Charlie Sheen's small but unforgettable role. Sheen plays the random bad boy teen Jeannie meets at the police station, whereas in the theatrical cut, he's just a cool stranger who gives her blunt advice. But surprisingly and originally, Hughes wrote a whole backstory. According to Sheen, he was supposed to be a classmate of Ferris and Jeannie. In interviews, Sheen explained that the script revealed that his character was actually a student who had gone down the wrong path by skipping too many classes, ending up in trouble, and now he was stuck in the juvenile system. The scene was meant to mirror Jeannie's future, showing her what bitterness and resentment could lead to if she kept obsessing over Ferris. Jennifer Grey remembered shooting extra lines where her character pushes back, asking why she should trust a delinquent. Sheen also added that Hughes trimmed it down because he realized the power of the encounter was in its brevity. The fans still debate whether keeping the whole dialogue would have deepened Jeannie's storyline or slowed the film's pace. Ferris's home was a real architect's house and was later sold. Ferris Bueller's home in the film wasn't a soundstage. It was a real suburban house in Long Beach, California, even though the film is set in Chicago. Hughes noted that he and his team scouted dozens of locations before choosing it because of its all-American look. A white, two-story home with a manicured lawn that felt familiar. In interviews, production designer John W. Corso explained that Hughes wanted Ferris's world to feel the house wasn't supposed to be a mansion or too flashy, just middle-class enough that audiences could believe Ferris was an every kid, even while he pulled off extraordinary adventures. The most famous house from the film wasn't Ferris's, it was Cameron's. That sleek glass-walled home in Highland Park, Illinois, where the Ferrari crashes through the window, is actually the Ben Rose house, which was designed by architect James Spire. It was built in 1953 and is considered a modernist landmark. Fans would visit for years after the film just to see the iconic garage. The house went up for sale at over $1 million in 2009, but sat on the market for years because of its unusual design and was eventually sold off. Matthew Broderick once joked in an interview that people still ask him, "Did you really live in that glass house?" He laughs and clarifies, "No, Ferris had the cozy one. Cameron had the house you'd never want to throw a baseball in." The use of real homes added texture to Hughes's storytelling. Matthew Broderick and Jennifer Grey on and off set. One of the behind-the-scenes stories of Ferris Bueller's Day Off is the real-life romance between Matthew Broderick and Jennifer Grey. On screen, the two were constantly locked in sibling rivalry. Off-screen, they secretly began dating during the production. In interviews, Grey admitted that the irony wasn't lost on her. "We were supposed to hate each other, and here we were falling in love." Broderick kept it more private, but their fellow stars have hinted they weren't exactly subtle. Alan Ruck joked once that the chemistry was obvious if you were paying attention. Their relationship became even more public a year later when they were involved in a tragic car accident while vacationing in Ireland. The incident left 2 people dead and made headlines worldwide. Broderick was seriously injured, and the attention put immense strain on their relationship. By the time Grey starred in Dirty Dancing, the two had quietly separated. Cameron's meltdown, a production note.
Listen, I mean, a good writer should know his subject, and I've got...
One of the emotional high points of the movie comes when Cameron has his explosive breakdown in the garage, kicking his father's Ferrari before it crashes through the glass wall. Alan Ruck noted that filming that moment was one of the most challenging parts of the job, both physically and emotionally. Ruck also added in interviews that he was nervous about whether he could convincingly play Cameron's bottled-up rage. "I wasn't a method actor, but John Hughes wanted it raw. He told me to think about all the times in my life I felt invisible or unwanted." Hughes encouraged him to channel his own frustrations into the performance. The garage scene was also tricky from a technical standpoint because the crew had to plan the stunt with the replica Ferrari carefully. The car was mounted on rigs to ensure it smashed through the window exactly as planned. There was only one chance to get it right, and Ruck's physical outburst had to match the timing of the effect. Looking back, Ruck says the scene worked because it wasn't just about destroying a car. It was about Cameron realizing he had to stop being afraid of his father. He finally lets all the anger out, and it's liberating. The movie put Twist and Shout back on the charts. The parade sequence in Ferris Bueller's Day Off is the most famous moment, and the choice of music made it unforgettable. When Ferris grabs the microphone and lip-syncs to the Beatles' Twist and Shout, the scene explodes into a giant street party. When Twist and Shout first emerged in the 1960s, it was already a hit, but radio stations started playing it non-stop after the movie's release in 1986. By September of that year, it re-entered the Billboard Hot 100 and climbed back to number 23. For a band that had broken up long before, it was a stunning comeback sparked by a teen comedy. Matthew Broderick later admitted that filming the parade was one of the most intimidating experiences of his career. There were thousands of extras, and I had to dance on top of a float pretending I wasn't terrified, he laughed. His fellow star Mia Sara said the energy on set was electric. Once the music started, you could feel the whole crowd just light up. It wasn't acting anymore. Everyone was celebrating spin-offs and cultural afterlives. Though John Hughes never made a sequel to Ferris Bueller's Day Off, the movie's cultural afterlife has been huge. In the year 1990, CBS aired a short-lived TV sitcom simply called Ferris Bueller. It starred Charlie Schlatter as Ferris and an unknown Jennifer Aniston as Jeannie. Critics panned it, and it was canceled after just one season. Over the decades, Ferris has been referenced everywhere, from The Simpsons to Family Guy to Super Bowl commercials. One of the most famous callbacks came in 2012, when Matthew Broderick appeared in a Honda ad during the Super Bowl. The commercial recreated Ferris's day off, with Broderick skipping work instead of school. For many fans, it was the closest thing to a sequel. There's also been talk of stage musicals and even a rumored reboot, though nothing concrete has come out. Most fans agree that Hughes' original is too unique to replicate because of its mix of teenage rebellion, Chicago spirit, and fourth-wall-breaking charm, which is lightning in a bottle. What do you think about this story? Please share your thoughts in the comments. And do not forget to share this video, like it, and subscribe to this channel. Before you go, click on the video displayed on your screen.